Thank you. Good morning. How's everyone doing? Still coming in? Okay. So I'm actually quickly going to start introducing myself before I go into the core of my presentation. So I'm Gabriel. I initially studied mathematics in Cambridge, then worked as a management consultant for Booz Allen Hamilton in Germany and the Middle East. I returned to the UK to do an MBA at London Business School and then became the head of data science for Tesco. After a couple of years of doing that, I became the data director at Not on the High Street. And in June last year, I joined the BBC as head of data science and architecture. So for those of you who at this point are thinking that maybe you drank too much and you walked into the wrong tent because it sounds all very data engineering and analytics, no, I'm actually here to talk to you about product. Because one of the things that I realized throughout my career was that actually a lot of my data roles were really product roles. A lot of what I was trying to do and figure out is how do I use the people that I have in order to build the best data products that would release the most amount of value to the organization. So generally, I come into an organization that doesn't yet take the best advantage of their data, and I then try and help them figure out how do you start on that data journey. Often that means first recruiting new capability, but it then also means navigating all of the different perceptions and expectations from your marketing teams, your finance teams, your technology teams. And not rarely, a lot of those expectations are quite heavily driven by shiny marketing procedures, prospectuses, that actually promise you that AI can pretty much solve everything. And so throughout the years, I've kind of iterated the process that I go through quite a little bit. I used to come in and try and build prototypes and do a bit of consulting. Now, in this latest iteration I'm going to talk to you about today, I much more prefer to build a full-stack development team. And actually today what I'm talking to you about is using a focused product to really drive bigger capability change. And so my discussion today will first of all focus on what's the problem statement that we were trying to solve, how do we then use prototypes in order to refine the challenges, and then finally build a full stack team in order to build a platform and an app that would create new audience experiences. Given my background, you might be slightly surprised that I'm not really going to talk to you about metrics or data or OKRs or KPIs or OMTMs or any of the wonderful stuff we've heard about yesterday. That's not because I don't believe in data-driven product management. It's much more a reflection of where we are within our product lifecycle at the moment. So generally, the BBC uses a metrics framework that we call Rubex. It measures reach, so the amount of users that use our products, usage, how much they use our product, breadth, how many products do they interact with, and finally, the quality of their experiences. Now, our product isn't live yet, so we don't have any real users, and that makes that much, much harder. My role is really all about trying to help the BBC take better advantage of its data and how to best use machine learning. And as you can imagine, for any organization that's been around for almost 100 years and that has about 20,000 employees, that can become quite a broad problem quite quickly. In order to help you understand that a little bit better, I thought I'd quickly take you through a bit of the BBC's history. So we were created in 1922 as a radio company. In the 30s, we added TV on the side. When then televised news, weather, and the Olympics came around in the 40s, kind of that was added to the TV. Color TV came around in the 60s. CFAX, which is kind of teletext in the BBC world, came around in the 70s. In the 80s, we built the BBC Micro, which actually potentially some of you gave you the first opportunities to learn programming. In the 95, we started pushing quite hard towards digital radio, and then in 1997, we were one of the first news organizations to really heavily bet on the internet and go online. In 2007, we created iPlayer, which is our video-on-demand platform that's still one of the bigger ones and definitely the biggest one in the UK. And so any organization that's been around for that long has quite a lot of data silos. And some of these data silos are organizationally. Only about 3 years ago did we restructure to have a single technology team. Before that, we had about 3. And some of those data silos are more technologically. And actually, I remember when I was interviewing for the role and I asked the chief architect, what kind of technology do you use? He answered everything. Now, having been in the role for a little bit, I realized that actually everything was not really an exaggeration. It is really, we use everything. Actually, though, despite all of that, the BBC is quite a successful organization. So every week, we reach about 92% of the UK adult population. We are the third most popular online service, in the UK, after Google and Facebook. Globally, about 140 million people use our online services. And if we actually take our linear services, so that's stuff like linear TV or radio, then every week we reach about just under 350 million users. That's more than the weekly users of Twitter. But we have a problem. Those data silos that I talked about earlier basically mean that we're shipping our org structure every single day. And we are asking our audiences to really adapt to that organizational structure in order to find the content that they care about. At the moment, we don't have a BBC that brings the best and the most relevant of our British, bold, and creative content to audiences. And as audiences get more used to personalized services, as they expect to have to do a lot less work, that is a bit of a challenge that we're trying to address. Now, you might wonder how, given that probably this problem has been around for probably since 1922 and day 2, how do you start solving something like this? And before I joined, the chief architect created something that he called the Connected Data Program. And the Connected Data Program's aim was all about trying to really figure out what the data challenges were. What that program did was it basically separated data into 3 broad buckets. There was audience data, which was already being taken care of by an audience data program. There was content data, and there was partner data. Since we're a content organization, content data was the thing that was really going to be important for connected data. Content data as well as how audiences interact with content data. And so when I came in, it was then my job to try and build, to continue building that narrative around how do you build on top of that content data. And one of the first things that I did was create this idea of a content graph. Now, the idea of a content graph was as much kind of a marketing thing because, you know, a lot of people had heard of Facebook's social graph, of Google's knowledge graph, as well as kind of this conceptual idea. It wasn't necessarily really something that was a technology implementation. So we weren't saying we're going to now build all of this on top of a graph database only. And then on the first Friday of me being within the BBC, what we ended up doing was we ran a workshop and we brought a bunch of people from across the organization together to try and figure out, okay, now that we have this idea of bringing content data together, we have this concept of a content graph, how do we make that actually more specific? What are the business problems that really depend on having this kind of capability? And that was actually pretty scary for me. So it was day 3 on my job, and I was now being put on this journey into the middle of the TARDIS, of this massive thing that looked much, much bigger on the inside in terms of the problem than on the outside. And I was being asked to figure out which buttons to push to get us started and get us moving. And luckily, just like the doctor, I had a few nice friends who were able to help me. So 2 program managers from inside of the BBC were working with me to try and figure out what we were going to do. They didn't really understand that much about data, which was kind of what I was bringing to the game, but what they really understood was the technology and the organization within the BBC more broadly. And so what we ended up doing is we decided that we were going to build 3 prototypes. One was going to be an audience-facing product, so it was all about how do we bring the best of the BBC content to an individual, how do we really personalize this, not to be based on BBC brands, but actually the best content we have that's relevant to the user, especially when they commute to work in the morning. The second one was an internal tool for program scheduling. One of the things that's actually quite interesting around the BBC is even though we have these different linear channels like BBC One, BBC Two, etc., some production teams actually don't have specifically a channel that they only produce for. So if you think about something like arts, for example, they might have some of their content on BBC One and on BBC Two, etc. That means they need to find ways of scheduling across all of the different channels, which all have their own demands themselves. They then need to overlay social media, etc. on top of that and need to figure out what impact that has for our online, the online content that's available. So actually, it's quite a complex optimization problem. And finally, in order to do all of this properly, what we needed was a tool that allows us to properly describe the content that we have. So a tool that allows us to tag the content so it could be later on found. At that point, there was 4 of us, only one of those people being really quite technical. So what we ended up having to do was to bring out some external help, and then the 3 of us acted as product managers for these 3 products. And we spent about 2 months building those prototypes to different degrees of kind of functionality. And then, even though those prototypes never actually created any kind of code that we were able to reuse, and we didn't really use them in order to put them in front of real audiences, or of the target audiences, they become incredibly important for us to be able to tell a story. And we're still sometimes using them today in order to kind of make a point and make something very specific. Now, this might sound like quite an expensive way of actually doing stakeholder management, right? You go in, you actually build something, you bring in external companies, etc. The one thing that you kind of need to understand about the BBC is we're a story organization, a story-led organization where really the smallest unit is the story. So having a very strong narrative is key to move a project forward. And so we took those 3 prototypes, and they basically became the props that we took to the Deputy Director General and the Chief Technology and Product Officer to agree the next step with them. And what we agreed was that we were going to create a audience-facing focused product. So this wasn't going to be a prototype anymore. Instead, it was going to be a real product that was going to be put in real audiences. And the reason why we felt that a focused product was so important is because if we were going to try and drive capability change, and we were going to build this connected data platform, if we didn't have a focused product, we were running 2 risks. One was either we were going to be asked to boil the ocean. You saw a bit earlier how many data problems there are in an organization that's been around for 100 years. And secondly, we were slightly nervous that actually what might happen is we end up building this amazing platform, but there's no product in front of it that allows us to service any of the capability to audiences. And so, because focus product was going to be audience-facing, we brought in the product manager who had previously run BBC products like BBC Weather and BBC News. And at that time, we also tried to actually recruit a product manager for the platform itself. Now, recruiting a product manager for the platform was actually significantly more challenging because we were looking for someone who had the right experiences from a technology side perspective, so understanding of machine learning, data, etc., and also the leadership capabilities to take the organization along on a wider journey. The interesting challenge that we had with bringing together a focused product as well as a platform was now we had to satisfy 2 kind of sometimes competing requirements. We needed to figure out how to trade off the user needs of the product that would drive the audience, but also the needs for the platform itself to test the hypothesis. And we had to do all of this while not stepping on the toes of the big BBC products that already exist, because obviously they have their roadmaps, they have their commitments, etc. And so one of the ways that we try to tackle this is by agreeing kind of 4 big hypotheses that both the app and the platform believed in we needed to show in order to, or we need to validate in order to make sure that we were on the right journey. And the first big hypothesis was that actually people are interested in having content from many BBC brands in one place. There's a reason potentially why at the moment we have a BBC News app, a BBC Weather app, a BBC Sports app, BBC iPlayer app, etc., etc. The second one was that actually people wanted to have a truly and fully personalized experience from the BBC. The third one was we were able to do all of this technically, and the fourth one, we could do all of this with new technology, a new team, and new ways of working. And I just want to quickly jump into the why some of this, why new technology, for example. So as in a big organization, probably about 2 years ago or something like that, we decided that we didn't want to just be a single cloud. We didn't just want a single cloud provider. We want to have the ability to rely on multiple clouds. And as any big organization, it took us a little bit of time to write that contract. So about 18 months later, when we were getting ready to start building, the contract with Google Cloud was just coming up. We had just been finalized. So actually, we were a team without much legacy. It made a lot of sense for us to start building on Google Cloud and start figuring out some of those challenges around how do you integrate with an estate that otherwise sits either on-prem or on AWS. The other reason why we ended up building on Google Cloud is that actually Google Cloud offered some of the stuff in the machine learning and data space in particular that looked quite interesting for us to explore. So while it might seem a bit crazy that you're doing a new team, a new product, a new ways of working, a new technology all at the same time, some of that was because we were trying to change the capability throughout the organization, and that basically requires you to do a few more things at a time. As we were talking a bit more, though, about what we were doing to more people, a lot of the rest of the business was coming to us also with their own hypothesis. So, for example, our chief technology and product officer came to us and said, actually, when you're doing this, what you should really be focusing on is explainable machine learning, because explainable machine learning is going to be really important. And somebody else would come to us and say, actually, when you're building this, make sure that you can launch globally from day one, because we need to be a more global organization. And so actually, what these hypotheses also did for us was help us to kind of avoid some of those distractions that can happen quite easily when you're early, because actually you end up running the risk of being an experimentation platform for everyone. And then you do not find out anything at all, and it's not particularly valuable. With these 4 things in mind, we started building an app team. We'd added another 2 app developers. We added 3 data scientists, a bunch of engineers. And we tried to figure out, okay, what is the app actually going to do? So we had a lot of user research, luckily, which made that a lot easier. So what we were going to do is, by looking at that user research and looking at what the BBC's product portfolio already satisfies at the moment, we figured out that actually we were really going to aim at the younger generation, so the 16 to 34-year-olds, because those people have less affinity to the BBC brand as do their parents. We know that those people use mobile quite heavily, so it was going to be a mobile app rather than a website. We know that they like to interact with short-form video, which was great as well, because the BBC currently doesn't have a short-form video proposition. The other benefit about this is actually building short-form video recommenders is a bit easier than long-form video recommenders, because you're basically asking your users to invest 5 minutes of faith into your recommendation engine rather than 45 minutes or something longer, so it felt like a slightly more tractable problem. The other benefit is kind of something slightly more technical, so the way that we are able to play out video on apps is much, much simpler than when we were trying to render articles in apps, for example. So actually, short-form video also made it slightly simpler for us to build technically. And finally, we decided to focus on helping users make best use out of their spare moments. So this wasn't going to be an app that helps you get updated on the latest of the news, or that helps you keep track of the scores of your favorite football team. It was going to be the app that you can take out when you have a bit of time and you want to feel good about yourself. Again, this is a space that the BBC is generally not that strong in. Generally, the BBC is considered a bit dry, quite informative, very serious. It's not that fun and engaging. So we knew that kind of what we had from we knew that these were really consistent with the user research. The one thing that we hadn't figured out at that point, and that's quite interesting given the talk that we just saw, was this whole kind of call to action at the beginning. How would we actually get our users to download the app and use the app in the first place? And you might think that actually at this point, that's really key. Try and sort that out first, and you shouldn't really move forward and really invest a lot of money until you know how you're going to get users to download the app. Now, please take into remember that we're not trying to build an app here. What we're trying to do is build a capability throughout the organization, and we're trying to use the app in order to drive a showcase. So actually, the fact that we didn't know how we were going to get people to download the app was annoying, but it didn't stop us developing it further at this point. So what we ended up doing is, at that point, despite not knowing how people are going to download the app, we started building a kind of broad architecture for this connected data platform, and we started building design prototypes for the app itself as well. And in February, we then moved to agree the broad goals for the app with the product direction steering group. The broad goals were going to be basically summarized as build the capability to link and surface the breadth of the BBC content to power personalized experiences in a way that summarizes what the platform was going to do in one sentence, and then design a personalized audience-facing proposition for the new generation. And the way that the BBC is organized means that actually we need to, the way that the BBC is run, because we're an organization that's paid by the public through fees, we cannot just build something for iOS or Android, so we had to build for iOS and Android at the same time. What we decided to do was we're going to try and take a very thin slice of the functionality across all of it, and that would create our minimum viable product that in turn would drive all of the requirements against the platform. The lucky thing we have by not being a startup is that actually there's a whole bunch of components that the BBC has already created that we can reuse. So for example, we don't need to worry about how do we create accounts, how do we sign in, etc. That's a library that we could just integrate in our products. Once that we've integrated that library, then we can decide quite easily how to write user interactions with content into a central audience database. We also have the ability already that there's a standard media player, so we don't really need to worry about how do we get the content onto people's devices, how do we do that seamlessly without buffering and all of that stuff. So luckily, there was a bunch of really strong components that we could reuse. Some of the challenges we still had, though, was that we were trying to push a lot of those components much further than any of the existing product teams had done beforehand. So even though those components were there, we still had to work quite closely with the product teams in order to help guide their roadmaps and drive that forward. Now, one of the lucky things that we had done early on is about half of our team was recruited internally. That meant those people had the right relationships and can talk to the product teams who were building those components and kind of understand how they were being used. The other thing that we had done quite well is we had gone out to a lot of our senior stakeholders who can then help convince their teams to prioritize some of our stuff, maybe above something else. In the most extreme way, actually, that collaboration meant that some of the people who were working on those products then were embedded into our team on attachment, which was really good from our perspective because it allowed us to really understand the detail of the technology that we were using, and it was really good for the product teams that were building those things because for the first time they were kind of experiencing their own products as a customer, and they could really tell what that meant for them. By the end of July, we had a kind of simple version of the app. That version of the app allowed you to log in using your BBC account. It allowed you to kind of go onto the homepage. There you would get a personalized feed of videos that we expected to be interesting for you. You could then play that short-form video with a bit of description underneath it. When you were playing the video, we would also recommend you relevant content. You could look at all of the history that you had interacted with us, and actually this history doesn't just take into account the content that you've watched in the app itself, but also content that you've watched in other places of the BBC. If something goes wrong, we can give you an error message. Actually, we were so lean that this was the only error message you would ever get. We just told you you were offline, even though you weren't sometimes. And you could log out again. So, you know, it was really the minimum viable slice that we were thinking of building. And at that point, we felt that, you know what, from an app perspective, this looks fairly good. It gives us all the thing that we wanted to do at the beginning. But then, we're not really just an app product. What we really are is a product that is all about personalization. And that's slightly more challenging to try and figure out when are you actually minimum viable from a recommendation perspective, for example. And usually, there is two ways of building recommendation engines. Broadly, the first simple way is you have it's content-based, so you have a bunch of data around your content. And the second one is it's user-based, so you kind of try and find users like someone else, and then you use that in order to recommend stuff. The challenge we have with content-based is actually the BBC has never had to use its data in the same way as this before. So that means that even certain fields like genre or synopsis or something like that can be quite sparsely populated for a lot of our content. Also, because we've never had to use content data like this beforehand, actually the way that we treat content data and content descriptions is not particularly similar across the organization. So for example, if the news team talks about Manchester City, they probably refer to the city of Manchester. If the sports team talks about Manchester City, they probably refer to the football club Manchester City. Now actually that creates a whole bunch of interesting problems around whether using the same words actually means the same stuff. The challenge we had with audience data was actually we have never had a proposition like this. So where are you going to get your training data from? Now, very few of the videos that we're showing within the app are just in the app itself. A lot of them are also available on the website and in other places. But because most of our products do not force sign-in, and because our logging is a bit different across all the different places, it doesn't necessarily give us a particularly good training set. So what we decided to do is actually, let's try and build the simplest possible model on top of metadata. Our hope was then that would give us the recommendations that we could show in the app to actual users, which would then give us the user data in order to train then a user-based model. That still leaves us with a problem around how do you know whether it's viable? It's quite easy, it's minimal, good, tick. How do you know whether it's viable? How do you know it's good enough? Now again, there's a bunch of industry standards that you can do here, and we did that typical stuff. So you take a bunch of your audience history, you chunk that into two parts, you use the first one in order to train your recommendation engine, that then recommends some content. You compare those recommendations with what the user actually did in their history. That then allows you to create something called a hit rate. The interesting problem with the hit rate, though, is it's just a number, right? Like, it's a number, depending how you define it, probably between 0 and 1 or between 0 and 100. How do you know whether a hit rate is good enough? You can do simple things like actually, okay, I'm going to compare that to if I gave you random recommendations or if I give you the most popular, but none of that really answers the question around whether or not this is good enough recommendations. The second challenge that we had, more broadly, was that actually because of our data was not particularly good, so that metadata challenge I talked about earlier, we never really knew how much of the content that we were creating actually made it throughout the app. So we didn't know whether all the good stuff that was somewhere in our buckets in the back actually was being surfaceable to audiences. And so what we ended up doing is that instead of going big bang instead of going big bang and launching the app properly to external audiences in July, what we were going to do instead was launch the app only internally to kind of our key stakeholders and kind of friends and family. What that allowed us to do is it allowed us to test with a slightly bigger team what worked, what didn't work. It also allowed us to really manage our stakeholders again and show, look, this is what you've been paying the money for, this is what we've been doing over the last couple of months. And it allowed us to make sure that actually we could recontract with our Chief Technology and Product Officer around what were we going to do properly over the coming weeks and months ahead. So then it was all about closing time. And by that time, by about August, the team had reached a size of about 30, so we had added more app developers, more engineers, more data scientists, more UX researchers and UX designers as well. And at that point, what we wanted to really do is close the app, so add less features, but instead really focus on what we call strengthening the platform. So it was all about making sure that we had the proper scaling in place so that actually if we would put this in front of users, it wouldn't just fall over. The proper logging, so if it did actually fall over, we would know what happened and how we could fix it. We want to make sure that enough videos were feeding through, that the recommendations were good enough, and that we had an experimentation platform so that actually once that we knew that we had algorithms out there, we could quickly test them against one against the other. What we were really keen, though, was about trying to kind of get the product in front of a minimum viable audience as quickly as possible. And that's why we didn't focus a lot on features initially. What we ended up doing in the end after all, though, was there was a bunch of features that we felt really were needed for the proposition, and luckily they were mostly extensions of the existing platform capability, so they didn't actually take us quite that much effort to bring them out into the stack. So those were things like adding you the ability for you to search, giving you the ability to like and dislike videos, giving you the ability to delete stuff out of your history as well. So during all of this time, we were running this internal trial, and what was quite interesting about this was that actually it didn't really deliver that much kind of stuff that we didn't already know. One of the big challenges we had was we had put this in front of an audience that probably wasn't quite representative of our target audience. And even for those people who were in the right age group, a lot of them are BBC employees or friends of BBC employees, so they may be not your general user. What it did, though, is it actually pointed out some really interesting editorial challenges. And this has been the first time that I've ever been in a discussion around who's going to go to prison if we get our product directions wrong. One of the things that you need to know about us, so we are a media organization, so we are both the publisher and the distributor of the content, so we are liable for the content we produce. We're not like Facebook or like Google, we're not a platform. And that means that actually, kind of for us getting this right, it has slightly different legal implications. And I just want to talk to you quickly about two of the examples that came up why we were running this with actual algorithms and actual content within that closed beta within the BBC. The first one is that usually the videos that we produce are embedded in a broader article. And what that allows us to do is it allows us to balance some of the views and to give a bit more context around that video. And therefore, we can explain if the video feels quite one-sided, we can explain why that person has made that statement, or we can explain some of the stuff in it. Now, our proposition only is video. There's no article around there. So actually, we needed to find new ways of making sure that our editorial values of being fair and of being impartial were being met. If we get this really, really wrong, then we can fall foul of defamation laws in the UK as well. So actually, there's a real legal background to making sure, a real legal reason to try and making sure this is right. The second example is around contempt of court. And again, these are actually based on examples that we were noticing in the app. So for example, if there is someone who's currently being accused of sexual harassment and there's a video of that person denying those claims, because we have a good content-to-content recommender, what will happen is the related content underneath that will give you more content around sexual harassment. If this stuff happens while this is being a court case, then actually there's a problem that maybe it could be considered contempt of court because our recommendations underneath it could be considered as a statement around that person's guilt. The BBC has never built a fully personalized app. The BBC has never had to deal with any of this stuff because usually everything that we show to audiences is editorially driven. And actually, therefore, none of the processes that we have been put in place so far really help us address this new paradigm of a fully personalized app and how to deal with it in that case. Luckily, we knew that this might be a problem, and so we recruited an editor into our team. And she was able to really help us understand some of the legal requirements we had and to help ensure that we are on the right side of the editorial values that are kind of one of the really core things of the BBC. And with her help, we were able to at least mitigate or at least understand a lot more of the risks that we have. So now we're a bit closer to actually to a public launch where we're hopefully going to get real audiences and real metrics. So I quickly just wanted to show you what the app looked like about 2 weeks ago. So you can go into the app, you can sign in with your usual username, etc. If you're already signed into another BBC app, it will notice that and you can come in. You then get a personalized stream. One of the things that you will notice is that actually all of this personalization is really, really important. The other thing you will notice is probably this app kind of looks what you already get with a lot of other apps. It doesn't look like massively different to what you expect from your YouTubes, etc. It is, however, fundamentally different to the way that the BBC currently provides you with content. At the moment, the BBC apps are very much focused on pages. They're focused on hierarchies. They're focused on editorial collections of stuff. In this case here, much more, it is personalized to you. So any video that we've shown that you've consumed in the past will not show up in your stream again. You will notice that sometimes we don't start the video at the beginning, but we start the video and where you've left off last. There's different ways of navigating through this. So we've come here because we care about health and well-being. So it's really about getting you a bit more lost in the wide variety of content that you have. We added the search mostly because actually what we realized is that we need to give people another way in, because at the beginning when we were just landing on that homepage, it was a bit like, oh, well, but how did I know what's happening here? We're trying to be as transparent as we can about what data we collect about you. So we always show you, it always gets updated that we have this history about you. As soon as you've played something, it will get added to the history. Also, the recommendation engine actually rebuilds itself every time you go to the front page. It will take your latest history. It builds a profile for you in real time, which means that actually we don't need to store any of that information beyond the historic data that we have for you. So the models get created on the fly. Again, you've seen here this video didn't start at the beginning. It started from where you've seen it beforehand. Again, here the case. We're trying to really take your own context in there as much as possible. Obviously, as the BBC, there's a lot of concern around how do you avoid echo chambers, filter bubble, and all of that stuff. So the homepage itself is semi-driven by editorial and semi-driven by your interests, and we make sure that if you get too much into a filter bubble, so if you only look at kind of 3 topics or something like that, we will enrich that with editorially driven topics as well that we know from our experience are generally something that our audiences like. Now, you would say, okay, this would probably generally be the end of my talk because we've now have an app, we're close to launching. But this isn't really about building an app. This isn't really about building a platform. This is really about changing the capability within the BBC. And so the next chapter I'm quickly going to talk to you about is this parting of ways. What we need to now do after we're hopefully going to be launching the app in a couple of weeks is to separate out the app from the platform. It's for them to become their own things by themselves. The reason why this is important for the app is because at the moment the app is perceived as this kind of thing that's just something in order to show some platform capability. It isn't perceived as kind of its own product within kind of the world of the iPlayers, the BBC News, etc. And similarly, from the platform perspective, at the moment we're perceived to be a backend for an app. And that's not really what we're interested in being. What we want to be is a capability building thing that can be used by multiple products in order to help the BBC become a bit more relevant for the next generation. The most ambitious thing that we want to do, and kind of for us as a platform, that means that we need to onboard more customers and more BBC products and services. We are in discussions with a few different teams around the BBC who are really keen to start building some showcases on top of that stack, because it actually gives them a lot of the stuff that they need for their personalization journey. The most ambitious aim, though, that we have is what we really want to do with this platform is reinvent the way that we do machine learning in production. Because at the moment, that's quite disjointed across the organization. For us, this app was always the first stage in order to build an ML as a platform capability that makes it much easier for teams to bring stuff out into, in front of customers. We strongly believe that there's always more smart people not working in our team than working in our team. So we need to give them the ability to really help us extend the stack. And so one of the things that we're going to be doing over the coming months is to try and figure out how we can do code ownership experiments with our R&D team. Our R&D team is really good in building algorithms. It's not so easy for them, though, to bring those algorithms in front of actual audiences to get actual feedback back to around whether stuff is working or not. So by reusing a lot of our stack, we now give them a way that is much easier, where really what they can focus on is algorithms rather than integration with data sources, app user experiences and all of that stuff. Some of these approaches are actually fundamentally different to the way that we work right now as an organization. And so it will take us a bit of time to embed this a bit more broadly. But what we've already seen is that by using a focused product to put our money where our mouth is, we've been able to shift a lot of the discussions more towards areas that are really key to our connected data strategy. And while we would never claim that this has been so purely based on us building a platform, we do believe that by coming along with this focused product and driving capability through this, we have been able to add the next chapter to the long BBC's history a little bit faster than we would have been able to do in other ways. And so just kind of what I want to do is sum up the 4 key learnings for me throughout this journey. And the first one is actually, while I really, really believe in data-driven product management, at the beginning, a lot of it is about the story. It's about the narrative that you're able to tell in order to bring an organization along on a journey that might be quite different to the way that they're currently working. That, however, is not an excuse to not understand your problem space. You still need to understand what's the customer problem that you're trying to solve, how you're going to make it better with what you're suggesting. And this is why actually I believe that a focused product can really help, because it can help drive organizational capability by focusing this quite nebulous problem of, oh my God, we don't know what to do with our data, into something that's quite specific and quite concrete. It helps you really focus down to a solution onto a small part, and therefore makes it more manageable and tractable. And what that allows you to do is it actually provides you with a method of building capability throughout your organization in a much more agile way. Because as you learn something, you adapt, you build something quite focused, and you then extend from kind of a back end to a platform to bigger capability. Thank you very much. All right, so did you consider creating a progressive web app instead of creating an app you need to download from the App Store? We did. One of the challenges that actually creates for us, though, is based on the website structure that we have within the BBC. Actually, one of the exercises the whole product team in the BBC once did is it printed out the whole BBC website. And we realized how many pages, how many walls we needed within the room where we were putting this up. So actually, it doesn't necessarily make it much, much easier for people to find the product. Also, app development is a bit easier because of the frameworks that we have available compared to web development. That's just kind of a technological stuff that is quite specific to the BBC. So we did look at it. We felt that it wasn't quite the right way. Apps were going to give us a bit more freedom than using responsive web. Privacy by design? Yes. Actually, initially, when I was preparing this presentation, I was hoping to be able to show you the link to where you can download the app itself from the App Store. Actually, at the moment, we are a bit delayed because of the data privacy impact assessment. One of the things that we try to do in terms of privacy by design is this thing that we're actually creating models on the fly. So we don't need to store any model about you. The only thing that we store about you is stuff that you already know we store about you, because it's the same stuff that the other products within the BBC would store about you. That was the attempt. The other attempt that we're trying to do is be quite transparent about, this is all the interactions that we've logged about you. That's why we have that you page. And finally, we're trying to be quite open about kind of what we write. So if you actually go to findouthow.datalab.rocks, you will see that we've written an article, and we've open sourced the training that, to help you build machine learning on top of iPlayer data. So we really want to be out there and tell people quite honestly around what it means that we're building. Have you ever validated your hypothesis in any way before building the MVP? So this is an interesting one. So there's a bunch of different hypotheses that we have, right? There's this massive hypothesis about bringing everything together. And obviously, we did build a bunch of user experience prototypes. We now also do, every 2 weeks, we do user studies, so where we bring people in. It's so fundamentally different to the way that we currently think about the BBC that it's an interesting question, what's the right way of building this in the right way? Also, this is not really about the product, this is about the platform. So even though we're not quite sure yet about whether some of these hypotheses are true, what we're noticing is that by having built that platform, a lot of that platform capability becomes relevant to completely different experiences. So for example, a voice experience where we have Alexa skills or something like that, as they move on through their journey, they're asking a lot of the same questions that we were asking at the beginning of our platform journey. So even though the product might potentially change quite a lot, or the app might never be that successful, we're hopeful that actually what we've built from a platform perspective is going in the right direction because we're getting the right questions from the rest of the product teams across the BBC. How do you integrate BBC's traditions in the new platform, new products? This is a great question. So one of the things that we think where we're different compared to a Facebook or Google or something like that is probably two things. We probably have better quality content because all of the content is produced by us to quite rigorous standards. And the second thing is we have about 100 years of editorial guidelines and editorial values that really drive the way that we tell stories, the way we put stories together. And there's kind of the first one, obviously, we will mostly surface, or we will only surface BBC content, so that kind of keeps a lot of those traditions. For the second one, as said, we've embedded an editorial person within the app product team to help us guide some of that stuff. And that person is making some of the choices around, for example, cold start recommendations. We're also using editorially curated lists to train some of our models as well. But I think there's a lot more that we still can do in order to really bring in those editorial values into the machine learning algorithms. And we don't know yet all of the ways of doing that.
Thank you. Thank you, Gabriel. Everyone, rounds of applause again, please, for Gabriel.